The first frost of the season had come the night before, and it lay across the courtyard of the Court of Common Pleas like a thin grey skin, so that the boots of every gentleman crossing toward the great doors left dark prints in it. Inside, the air smelled of wet wool and tallow and old paper. And into that hushed wood-paneled room, on a morning when the greatest man present believed the day belonged entirely to him, walked a woman in a plain grey gown with 3 children at her side, and the room went very quiet, the way a room does when it senses before any person in it understands that something is about to be undone. Her name was Margaret Ellison, and she was 26 years old. She held the smallest child against her hip, a girl of perhaps 4, and the 2 others, a boy and a girl older than the first, stood pressed close to her skirts, with the stillness of children told that this is not a place for noise. The benches along the wall were full of men in dark coats come to watch a great lord defend his name, and not one of them had expected the name to be defended against this, a woman with no jewels, a woman whose gloves had been mended at the seam. To the gallery that morning, she was nothing more than a problem someone else had failed to settle quietly, and they said as much behind their hands, the words traveling along the bench in a low current. "A nobody," one of them murmured to his neighbor. "A nursemaid with a grievance and 3 brats to wave about." The neighbor laughed softly into his cravat. "Stay with me through this one, because you will want to see how it ends." And a moment of your kindness in the comments helps stories like hers find the people who need them. She did not hear the laughter. She had heard worse in quieter rooms. At the front of the chamber, behind a table of dark oak, sat Julian Hartley, Viscount Ashbourne, and he did not turn his head when she entered. He was perhaps 34, tall, with the kind of stillness other men mistook for ease, and that was in fact a great and continual labor. His coat was the deep blue of a winter evening, and his cravat was white and exact. His face in profile against the grey window might have been carved for a tomb. He had been told that a woman intended to make a claim against his estate, and he had instructed his solicitor to have the matter dismissed before noon, and he had come chiefly to lend the weight of his presence to the dismissal. He had not asked the woman's name. He had not thought it would matter. What he did not yet know, what none of them knew, was that he had seen the smallest child's face before, in a place he had spent 3 years trying not to remember, and that the seeing of it again would take from him every defense he had built since. The matter had begun, as these matters do, with a death and a paper. Margaret had served 4 years in the household of the late Mrs. Medea. Coombe, a widow of modest means, in Hertfordshire as companion, nurse, and finally, the only soul willing to sit through the long nights of the old woman's dying. And in those nights, Mrs. Coombe had given her something, a folded letter and a small painted miniature in a brass case, and had made her promise, with the last clear strength she had, that Margaret would carry both to London and place them before a court and not be turned aside by any man's anger. The children were not Margaret's. That, too, the gallery had wrong. They were the children of Mrs. Bong. Coombe's late daughter, Anne, left to Margaret's keeping the way a candle is handed to the last person standing in a dark hall, because there was no one else. The eldest was a boy of 7 named Thomas, grave and watchful, who had learned too early to make himself small. The middle child was a girl of 5 named Beatrice, who still asked questions. A kinder world would have answered. And the youngest, on Margaret's hip, was Clara, 4 years old, with dark hair and a small frown of concentration she wore, even in sleep. Margaret had spent the last of her wages on coach fare, and a ribbon for each of them, and had stood in the frost that morning and told them quietly that they must be very brave, and that whatever happened, she would not let go of their hands. The solicitor for the estate was a thin, precise man named Mr. Fellow, and he rose now with a small smile and addressed the magistrate as though the whole business were a tedious courtesy. The claim, he said, was that the late Mrs. Coombe's grandchildren were owed support from the estate of Viscount Ashbourne on the grounds of a connection, The estate entirely denied. He let the word denied sit in the air a moment. His lordship, he continued, had never married, had fathered no children, and had certainly never set eyes upon the woman now standing before them. The matter was an imposition upon the court's time and his lordship's patience. Margaret listened with her chin level and her eyes steady, and when the magistrate, an old man with kind, tired eyes named Sir Henry Vane, asked whether she had anything to say, she said that she had, and that she would say it plainly, and that she asked only to be heard to the end before she was sent away. Sir Henry inclined his head. The Viscount at his table finally turned to look at her, and his look was cold, and it was meant to be cold, and Margaret met it without flinching. And somewhere beneath the coldness, where she could not see it, something in him registered her the way a man registers a sound in the dark that he cannot yet name. She began with the simplest fact she had. 7 years ago, in the spring, a young woman named Anne Coombe had been a guest at the great house at Ashbourne, brought there as companion to a cousin of the family for a single season, and she had left in the autumn quietly and had told no one why. Margaret did not say what the gallery was already thinking. She did not need to. The men on the benches shifted and glanced at one another and at the Viscount, and the Viscount's face did not change at all, which was itself a kind of answer to those who knew how to read it, though Margaret did not. A widow, came the murmur again from the benches, a widow with debts and a clever story. And Margaret, who had been called a great many things in her life, took the word and set it down inside herself, and did not let it show on her face. She had learned, long ago, that her composure was the only property the world could not mend at the seam, and take from her. What the gallery saw was a plain woman making an outrageous claim. What the audience of her own heart saw, and what the Viscount's body had begun to register against his will, was a woman telling the truth in a room built to disbelieve her. His hand, resting flat upon the table, had drawn very slightly inward, the fingers curling toward the palm, toward the inner pocket of his coat, where a thing lived that he had carried for 3 years and shown to no one. The morning wore on. Mr. Fellow produced the household ledgers of Ashbourne and read from them in a dry voice, demonstrating that no payment had ever gone from the estate to a Mrs. Coombe or an Anne Coombe. He produced a letter from the senior steward, attesting that the Viscount had been abroad for much of the relevant period. He was thorough, and he was confident, and confidence of that polished kind was a thing Margaret had watched fail before in the sick rooms where she had done her real living, because confidence could not nurse a fever, and it could not sit through a dying, and it could not, she suspected, hold up against a single true thing said at the right moment. She waited. She had only the one moment when Mr. Fellow had finished, and resumed his seat with the satisfaction of a man folding a finished letter. Sir Henry turned to Margaret and told her, not unkindly, that the estate's case appeared sound, and that unless she could produce some evidence beyond her own account, he would be obliged to dismiss the claim. The benches stirred with the pleasure of an expected ending. The Viscount allowed himself, for the first time, the smallest easing of his shoulders. Margaret set the youngest child down upon her feet, knelt for one moment to whisper something to her, and then took from inside her own modest reticule a brass case, no larger than a pocket watch, worn smooth at the edges by years of being held. She did not open it. She held it up so the magistrate could see it, and then she said the thing she had carried 200 miles to say. She said that Mrs. Coombe had given her this on her deathbed, and that it had been Anne's, and that Anne had been given it by the man who had promised her marriage and then gone abroad and never written, and that inside it was a likeness, and that the likeness was not of Anne. The room had gone entirely still, and the Viscount at his table had risen halfway from his chair before he knew that he had moved. That is the moment to hold, and you may comment below if you have ever watched a careful man forget himself entirely, because what happened next happened slowly, the way the most important things always do. Now let me take you back so that you understand what that brass case truly weighed. 3 years before any of this, Julian Hartley had been a different man, or rather the same man, with one door of himself still open that was now nailed shut. He had returned from the continent in the late autumn to find a letter that had been waiting 4 months from a young woman he had known, briefly and entirely, in a single season at his own house, before his uncle's death pulled him abroad to settle a second estate. He had meant to send for her, and had been prevented, month upon month, by law, and distance, and the small cowardices that distance makes easy. The letter told him she was with child. By the time he read it, the letter was 4 months old, and the woman who wrote it was, he learned within the week, already 2 months dead of a fever in a county he had never visited, leaving behind, he was told, nothing at all. He had believed that nothing. He had let himself believe it, because belief was cheaper than the alternative. And he had carried the miniature she had once pressed into his hand, a small painted likeness of his own face that she had commissioned in secret, and given him as a jest, and he had carried it for 3 years, as other men carry a stone they cannot set down. And he had told himself the child, if there had ever truly been a child, was gone with its mother into a silence he had no right to disturb. He had been wrong. The miniature in Margaret's hand was the twin of the one in his coat. They had been painted as a pair. Back in the cold courtroom, the present resumed its hold. Sir Henry asked Margaret to bring the case forward. The Viscount said, in a voice that came out lower than he intended, that he would see it. Margaret crossed the floor and placed the brass case in the magistrate's hand, and Sir Henry opened it and looked at the small painted face within, and then looked up slowly at the man standing rigid behind the oak table. And the likeness between the painted face and the living one was a thing the entire gallery could see at once. And the murmur that ran through the room then was of an entirely different kind than the one that had greeted Margaret's arrival. Mr. Juror. Fellow was on his feet at once, saying a painted likeness proved nothing, that any competent hand could counterfeit a resemblance, that the court must not be swayed by theater. And he was right, that it proved nothing in law by itself. Yet the Viscount no longer listened to his solicitor. He had come around the table, and was looking, not at the miniature but at the smallest child, at Clara, who had wandered a half-step from Margaret's skirts, and was looking up at the tall man with the small frown of concentration she wore even in sleep, the frown he had seen, that exact frown, every morning of his life in his own shaving-glass. He knelt. A Viscount, in public court, before 40 men who had come to watch him win, went down on one knee on the cold flagstones so that his eyes were level with the child's, and he did not speak. And the child did not speak. And the whole vast machinery of the law and the season and the family name hung suspended above the two of them like a held breath. Then Clara, with the unbothered directness of the very young, reached up and touched the cold buttons of his coat, one after another, counting them in a whisper, and the man's careful face broke in a way no one in that room would ever quite be able to describe afterward, though every one of them tried. Margaret watched him kneel, and understood, all at once, and far too late for her own composure, that this was not a cold man at all. This was a man who had been carrying a grief so heavy that coldness had been the only posture in which he could stand. Her hand found the back of Thomas's neck, steadying the boy, steadying herself, and the part of her that had spent 4 years learning the difference between a hard heart and a wounded one. In the long nights of Mrs. Bate, Coombes dying, knew the difference now, and the knowing of it frightened her more than the magistrate ever had. Order was restored, after a fashion. Sir Henry, who had presided over 40 years of human ruin and recovery and had a sound instinct for the difference, adjourned the matter to his private chambers rather than let it become a spectacle. He invited the Viscount, his solicitor, Margaret, and the children to follow, and closed the door on the gallery, which was left to spread the story through every drawing-room in London by nightfall, and did. In the chambers, with a fire lit and the children settled with bread and butter, the kind old magistrate had ordered up without being asked, the true matter began to be untangled, chiefly by the Viscount himself, who took from his coat the second miniature and set it beside the first, and the 2 painted faces looked up with the same eyes, and Mr. Fellow fell silent, and stayed silent, for he knew when a case was over. The Viscount did not make excuses. That was the thing Margaret had not expected, and it was the thing that undid the last of her defenses. He said in a level voice that cost him a great deal that he had received Anne's letter 4 months too late, that he had believed her dead and the child with her, that he had been a coward not to make further inquiry, and that the cowardice was his and would always be his, and that no court could assign it more justly than he had already assigned it to himself. Across 3 years, he looked at the children while he said it. He did not look at Margaret. He could not yet, Sir Henry asked the practical questions. Where had the children lived? Who had kept them? What had become of the late Mrs. Coomb's small estate? And Margaret answered each one plainly, and the picture that emerged was of a chain of women who had caught these children as they fell. The grandmother first, and then when the grandmother sickened, the governess who had no obligation to them at all, and had taken them anyway, because there had been no one else, and because she had looked at 3 frightened children, and been unable to do the arithmetic that would have let her walk away. "You took them," the Viscount said at last, when the practical matters were exhausted, and it was the first thing he had addressed directly to her, and his voice was not cold now, it was only very quiet. "You had nothing, and you took them." "There was no one else," Margaret said. "It was not a hardship. It was only what one does." And he looked at her then, fully for the first time, and Margaret felt the look move through her like the heat of the fire beside her, and she kept her face composed and her hands in her lap betrayed her, tightening on the worn fabric of her gown, and she hoped he had not seen. He had seen. He saw a great many things. He gave no sign of seeing. The arrangement that Sir Henry proposed, and that the Viscount accepted before the magistrate had finished proposing it, was that the children should be acknowledged as his wards and brought into his protection, and that the woman who had kept them should remain with them as their governess, so that the children should not be torn a second time from the only constancy they had known. It was a sensible arrangement. It was the obvious arrangement. And Margaret, who had prayed in the frost that morning for nothing more than that the children should be provided for, found that the granting of her exact prayer had opened a new and far more dangerous door, because it meant she would now live under his roof and see his face every morning, and learn the wound that lived behind his coldness from close at hand. And she did not yet have a name for what that prospect did to her, though her body had already named it before her mind would consent. The house at Ashbourne stood in its park like a grey ship at anchor, and when the carriage came up the long drive in the failing light, the children pressed their faces to the glass, and went silent with wonder, and Margaret felt the old fear rise, the fear of the plain woman crossing into the saturated world, and put it down again, because the children were watching her for how to feel, and she would not teach them to fear their own home. A housekeeper met them at the door, a square, capable woman of 60, named Mrs. Pryor, who had been at Ashbourne 40 years and had buried 2 generations of the family, and who looked at the 3 children, and at the worn ribbon in each child's hair, and at the governess with the mended gloves, and made in the space of a single glance a private judgment that she kept to herself, but that warmed her manner by several degrees. Mrs. Pryor would prove, in the weeks that followed, to be the second person at Ashbourne to understand Margaret entirely, the Viscount being the first, though neither of them yet knew the other knew. The weeks settled into a shape. Margaret kept to the nursery and the schoolroom, and did not presume upon the rest of the great house, and the Viscount kept to his study and his cold civility, and the 2 of them might have passed an entire winter without speaking more than necessity required, except that the children would not permit it. Clara in particular had attached herself to the tall grave man with a 4-year-old's total absence of doubt, and she would toddle into his study unannounced, and climb into the chair beside his, and frown over his ledgers, in perfect imitation of his own frown, and he, who had governed estates and faced down creditors and rivals without altering his expression, was entirely defenseless against her. Margaret would come to retrieve the child apologizing, and find the Viscount with a pen gone dry in his hand, and an expression on his face that he wiped away the instant he saw her, and the wiping away told her more than the expression would have. "Come in." he said to her one evening, when she had appeared in the study doorway to collect Clara, and had begun her usual retreat. It was a command, level and low, the kind of thing he said to footmen. "Sit. You have been standing in doorways for 3 weeks. Eat something, you are thinner than when you came." There was a plate of cold game and bread on the side table. Untouched, his own supper that he had not troubled to eat. Margaret heard the command, and almost obeyed it as a command, and then she saw the plate, and understood that the order to sit and eat was not an order at all, but the only language in which this man knew how to offer care, and she sat, and she ate, and across the desk he watched her with the quiet attention of a man watching rain after a drought, and neither of them said anything more. And it was, Margaret thought afterward, in the dark of the nursery the most intimate hour she had passed in years. The world outside the park did not let them alone. The story of the courtroom had run through London like a grass fire, and into the cold ash of it stepped the Viscount's aunt, the Dowager, Countess of Marchwood, who arrived at Ashbourne unannounced in a black travelling carriage, with a footman in livery, and a determination as hard and bright as the diamonds at her throat. The Dowager was a woman of 70 who had spent her whole life as a custodian of the family's name and consequence, and she had not buried a husband and a brother, and steered the family through 2 financial panics, in order to watch the last Viscount of the line saddle himself with another woman's bastards and a governess with a mended glove. She did not think of herself as cruel. She thought of herself as the only person in the family with the courage to say what was necessary, and she said it. "These are not your children," she told her nephew in the long gallery on the first morning of her visit, with the portraits of 3 centuries of Hartleys looking down. "And even if they were, the law does not compel you to ruin yourself for them. Send them to be raised decently in the country with an allowance and have done. As for the woman," she said, and here she paused to choose the word, "the woman is a nursemaid who has seen her chance and taken it, and you are a fool if you cannot see it. And your mother, God rest her, would weep to see you so taken in." The Viscount said nothing that the Dowager could fasten upon. Margaret, who had been crossing the far end of the gallery with Beatrice's hand in hers, and had stopped at the sound of the raised voices, heard the word nursemaidland for the second time in a new setting and a new mouth, and felt the old practiced stillness settle over her like a familiar cloak, and led Beatrice away before the child could ask what the cross old lady had meant. The Dowager stayed a fortnight, and she did not come to harm the children, but she came to manage. She brought with her, in the 2nd week, a guest, summoned by letter, a Miss Cordelia Stanhope, 24, the daughter of an old family and the possessor of a handsome dowry and a face the season had agreed to admire, and she installed Miss Stanhope at Ashbourne with the transparent intention of reminding her nephew what a suitable match looked like. There sat beside the unsuitable one she suspected him of contemplating. Miss Stanhope was not unkind. She was only certain, in the way of a woman told all her life, that she is the correct answer to a question, and she was bewildered to find the question seemed to have changed. She wore ice-blue silk to dinner, and made pleasant conversation about the London season, and watched, with a small growing frown of her own, the way the Viscount's eyes went, again and again, despite every effort of his will, to the plain doorway through which the governess came and went. There came an evening, in the 3rd week of the Dowager's residence, when Margaret witnessed the wound entire, and after it she could not pretend she did not understand him. She had gone down late to the library for a book to quiet Thomas, who could not sleep, and found the Viscount there alone, not reading, sitting before the dying fire with the 2 miniatures in his open hand, the painted face of the woman he had failed, and the face he shared with the daughter he had not known he had. He did not hear her at first, and in the firelight, with his guard entirely down, his face was not the face of a cold man at all, but the face of a man at a graveside, and he was speaking, very low, to the small painted likeness of Anne, and what he said was that he was sorry, that he had not known, that he would have come. And Margaret stood in the dark doorway, and understood that she was witnessing something that was not meant for her, and understood too that the coldness she had taken for arrogance had been, all along, the discipline of a man holding himself together over a grief he believed he deserved. She must have made some sound. He looked up, and for a moment the guard was not back in place, and they looked at one another across the room with nothing between them at all. And then he closed his hand over the miniatures and the discipline returned, and he said, in his level voice, that she should not creep about the house at night. The command had no force in it. It was the reflex of a man reaching for armor he had already dropped. Margaret crossed the room instead of retreating, which surprised them both, and she said quietly, that grief, carried alone for 3 years, was not grief that healed, and that she had sat through a great many deathbeds and learned that the ones who suffered most were always the ones who believed they had no right to be comforted. And then, because she had said more than she meant to, she took her book and went. And behind her she heard him say her name, once. Lo! Margaret, not Miss Ellison, Margaret. She did not turn around. She climbed the stairs with her heart going like a hare's and her face perfectly composed, and she lay awake until the gray came and she knew that she was lost. The proximity that follows such a night is the most dangerous kind, because it is no longer deniable to either party and must therefore be more carefully denied. They were correct with one another. They were unfailingly proper. And the propriety became its own form of intimacy, a thing they built together without ever naming it. In the schoolroom, where he began on some mornings to appear and sit at the back and listen to her teach his children their letters, and in the park, where they walked at a careful distance with the children running ahead, and in the small nightly ritual of the cold supper in the study, that neither of them ever spoke of and neither of them ever broke. Once, reaching at the same moment for the same fallen book, their hands met, and neither drew back as quickly as propriety required, and the heat of it traveled up Margaret's arm and lodged somewhere beneath her ribs, and she carried it for days. Once he lifted Clara onto his shoulders in the park, and the child shrieked with joy, and Margaret laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh, unguarded. And he turned at the sound of it with an expression she had never seen him wear, and she felt herself color to the roots of her hair and was glad of the cold wind to blame it on. I should not be here, he said to her once low in the schoolroom, after the children had run out to their dinner, and the two of them were left among the slates and the chalk. I should be in London. There is a great deal I should be doing. He was not speaking of London. They both knew he was not speaking of London. What he was saying, in the only language he had, was that he could not stay away from the room she was in, and that the failure of his discipline frightened a man whose discipline had been the only thing holding him upright for 3 years. And Margaret heard all of it, and could not answer it. Because to answer it, honestly, would be to say a thing a governess could not say to a viscount. And so she said only that the children were glad of his company, and he looked at her as though she had said something else, entirely, and perhaps she had. The dowager was not blind. She had spent 70 years reading rooms, and she read this one, and being a woman of action, she resolved to settle the matter before it became a scandal. She chose her moment with care. She chose the largest possible audience. The occasion was a dinner, the first large entertainment the house had given since the children came, arranged by the dowager, on the pretext of introducing Miss Stanhope to the county. 30 guests sat down at the long table beneath the chandeliers, the cream of 3 counties, and the dowager had seen to it that Margaret was present, seated far down the table like an upper servant promoted for the evening, precisely so that what she intended could be done in front of everyone. Between the second course and the third, in a lull engineered for the purpose, the dowager turned her bright, hard gaze down the length of the table and addressed Margaret directly, and asked her, in a voice pitched to carry, how a nursemaid from a Hertfordshire sick-room found the great dining-room of Ashbourne, and whether she did not feel herself a very long way from her proper station. There it was. The third time the word nursemaid spoken now in the most public arena the house possessed before 30 witnesses, with the deliberate intention to wound and to remind and to put the plain woman back in the place the world had assigned her. The table went still, Miss Stanhope looked down at her plate. And Margaret, who had taken that word 3 times now and set it down inside herself 3 times, felt something in her that was not composure at all rise up and steady her. And she lifted her chin, and she was framing the quiet, honest answer that 4 years of sick rooms had taught her how to give. At the head of the table had set down his glass. This was the dark moment, though it did not look like one, because the dark moment in such a story is not always a loss. Sometimes it is the instant before everything turns, dressed exactly as a loss, so that no one sees the turn coming. Margaret believed in that suspended second that she had reached the end of her welcome, that the great machinery had finally caught her, that she would answer the dowager with dignity and then quietly arrange to be gone, before her presence cost the children the home she had won them. She had already begun in her mind to let go, and it was precisely then, when she had given up the thing she wanted most in order to protect what mattered more, that the man at the head of the table rose to his feet. He did not raise his voice. He had never in his life needed to raise his voice. He stood, and the length of the table fell silent before him. And the dowager's bright certainty flickered for the first time because she knew her nephew, and she had never seen him stand like this. He looked down the table, past the diamonds and the silk and the 30 turned faces, to the plain woman in the gray gown who had crossed a courtroom for 3 children who were not her own, and he said the thing that ended it. "Margaret Ellison is to be my wife." 6 words. The silence that followed them was complete. He had not announced an engagement. He had announced an accomplished fact, in the present tense of a man stating something already true. And there is no arguing with a fact. And the dowager, who had armed herself against a courtship she could disrupt, found herself facing a marriage she could not. Her hand rose to the diamonds at her throat. Her mouth opened and produced nothing. The bright, hard certainty that had carried her through 70 years and 2 financial panics simply ran out, the way a clock runs down, and she sat back in her chair, and for the first time in the memory of anyone present, the Dowager Countess of Marchwood had nothing whatever to say. And then into that perfect silence, the small sounds of the world coming right began. Miss Stanhope, to the surprise of the table and somewhat to her own, was the first to move. She lifted her glass a careful inch toward Margaret, an honest gesture from a woman who had been raised to be the correct answer and had the grace in the end to recognize that she was not, and to bear it well. An old gentleman near the foot of the table said, well, to no one in particular, and then said it again. Mrs. Bree, Pryor, who had no business being in the dining room at all and had stationed herself near the door precisely so that she might witness this, pressed her lips together hard and turned her face away and was seen, by those near her, to be weeping, and was not ashamed. Margaret did not move. She sat with the word wife settling over her like the first warmth after a long cold. And she looked down the length of the table at the man who had just dismantled in 6 level words the entire apparatus that had spent her whole life telling her she was forgettable. And she found that her famous composure had finally and completely failed her, and that she was not sorry. The Viscount came down the length of the room. He did not stride. He walked, unhurried, a man with all the time in the world now, and the guests drew back their chairs to let him pass, and he stopped beside her and offered her his hand, palm up, in front of all of them, and waited. And Margaret, governess, nursemaid, nobody, the woman the season had decided not to see, put her mended glove into the bare hand of the Viscount of Ashbourne, and rose to stand beside him, and the room which had assembled that evening to watch one woman be put in her place, witnessed instead a woman raised to the only place she had ever truly wanted, which was beside someone who saw her. There was a great deal still to settle, and it was settled in the weeks that followed, with a speed that wealth and a magistrate's goodwill can purchase. The children were formally acknowledged, their place in the world made unassailable. The question of the estate resolved past any later challenge by the entitled cousins who might have raised one. The dowager, after a fortnight of cold silence, did a thing that surprised everyone, including herself, which was to sit one afternoon in the nursery and let Clara count the buttons on her sleeve, and to discover in that small transaction that she had been protecting a name when she might have been loving a family, and that the second was the better office, and that it was not, even at 70, too late to change posts. She was corrected, not destroyed. The family had room for her still. They were married quietly, in the small gray church at the edge of the park, with the frost again on the ground, a year almost to the day from the morning Margaret had carried 3 children up the courthouse steps. There was no great crush of the season. There was Mrs. Pryor, weeping again unashamed, and Sir Henry standing as a kind of father to the bride, and the dowager in the front pew with Clara on her lap, and Thomas grave and proud in a new coat, and Beatrice asking, in a carrying whisper, whether they might have cake, and the whole small warm company laughing, and the Viscount watching Margaret come up the aisle toward him, with an expression he no longer troubled to hide. If this story has stayed with you, I hope you will carry it gently into your evening, and tell someone who needs to hear that the world's first verdict is rarely its last. That winter, the great grey house at Ashbourne was warmer than it had been in a generation. The fires were kept high in rooms that had stood cold for years. The schoolroom, filled with the noise of 3 children who had stopped, somewhere in the autumn, making themselves small. And on the longest night of the year, with snow falling slow and steady past the tall windows and settling on the park, Margaret sat by the fire in the room that had become her own, with Clara asleep against her shoulder, and the Viscount came in from his estate business and stood a moment in the doorway. Not because he was held there by any duty, but because the sight before him was the thing he had stopped believing he would ever have. On the small table beside Margaret's chair lay the 2 brass miniatures. Side by side, the painted face of Anne, and the painted face that the father and the daughter shared, no longer hidden in a coat pocket, no longer carried like a stone, but set out in the open in a warm room where the child who had her father's frown slept safe in the arms of the woman who had refused to do the arithmetic that would have let her walk away. He crossed the room and looked down at the sleeping child, and at the 2 small painted faces in the firelight. And he did not say that he was sorry now because the sorrow had at last been allowed to set down its burden. He only rested his hand for a moment on the dark head of his daughter, and then on the shoulder of his wife, and the snow went on falling past the window onto the park, that the children would learn by heart, and the fire settled, and somewhere down the dark corridors of the warm house a clock struck the hour, and no one counted it. Outside, the frost held the world still. Inside, a candle burned beside the 2 small faces, and did not go out.